Yeah, that's the one. Great. Excellent. Shall I start again?
Thanks.
We'll start again. Okay, one of the defining questions of 19th century architectural discourse was first articulated in Germany in 1828 by Heinrich Hubsch. In what style shall we build? His book ignited intense debate among architects and writers in Germany about the relative merits of the predominant style of academic neoclassical design in Germanic 18th and early 19th century architecture, and more structurally rationalist expressions in construction then gaining ground in France. The idea that material should determine style. This debate fermented around the continent in the 19th century in architectural pamphlets, journals and lectures, in which claims for an architecture that revived the Gothic through a new, modern and vigorous interpretation of medieval design grew ever stronger. In England, this question was debated with particularly ardent polemic. Augustus Pugin published his Contrasts in 1836, two plates shown here, which argued forcefully for the merits of the Gothic revival of architecture against the relative meanness shown below of contemporary design in hoc to the new and alienating forces of industrialization. This was followed up in 1841 by True Principles, which established Christianity and the Gothic as the essential foundations of architecture. Pugin attacked a number of pagan architects, contemporary classicists, on whom he heaped particular scorn. And Ruskin, a little later, refined the revivalist argument, insisting that the nature of Gothic architecture was explained by the freedom of the craftsman in the process of construction. And on the left, I'm showing you O'Shea, Henry O'Shea, one of two craftsmen working on Dean and Woodward's new University Museum for Oxford, pictured in the centre, of which Ruskin on the right was a champion. It was in the realm of ecclesiastical architecture where the battle of the styles, as this debate came to be known, was often fought most vigorously in the 19th century, though, as William White has recently shown, this came from a shared fundamental religious and cultural belief that buildings mattered, their basic form, ornamentation and liturgical disposition, and that architecture was integral to Christian worship. The Battle of the Styles, however, reached fever pitch when a secular project in 1859, in which Lord Palmerston successfully blocked Sir George Gilbert Scott's Gothic designs for the new government offices at Whitehall, now the Foreign Office, which resulted in a modern Italianate palazzo design shown above. Style had seemingly become an issue of national importance, or was it, in fact, a proxy for questions about national character and politics? In reality, the Victorian period should be characterised as an age of doubt, in which the dilemma of style, paraphrasing Joe Mordaunt Crook, overwhelmed architectural discourse. And if the question, in what style shall we build, echoed down the 19th century, at the dawn of the 20th, the assessors of the competition for a new Anglican cathedral in Liverpool were unambiguous in their response. The style, they wrote into their competition conditions, shall be Gothic. The Diocese of Liverpool had been founded as late as 1878, and despite a winning design for a new cathedral being selected after a competition in the 1880s, it was only in 1900 that efforts were revived to solicit designs for a new complex of buildings. A committee of lay assessors was announced in 1901, and on September 23rd that year they resolved that, after selecting an architect on the basis of portfolio submissions, the winning man would be expected to produce designs in the Gothic style. This foolish, mischievous resolution, as the magazine The Builder described it, elicited a furious response from the architectural press. Reginald Bloomfield wrote in the Architectural Review that, quote, "The implied sacrosanctity of Gothic is a poisonous heresy based on a misconception of the nature of architecture." John James Burnett asked, "Why talk of style?" And J. Alfred Gotch condemned the, quote, "widespread fallacy that Gothic is an ecclesiastical style." The committee, the AR concluded, simply did not realise how little they were appealing to the prevailing spirit in the art by prescribing a strict adherence to any historical style, and how much talent they must exclude by limiting the competitors to Gothic. But what had really agitated the architectural community about the competition stipulation was less the debatable rightness of Gothic, and more the restriction on the architect's artistic freedom to decide for himself. And this reflected a major controversy of the 1890s, where a row had erupted as to whether architecture was a profession, which could be subject to a fixed educational curriculum and statutory regulation, or an art whereby the designer was free to innovate and where genius could flower untrammeled. These were the arguments. The Architectural Review's anger was also aimed at procurement, the way that the competition had been organised. Professionals, it was felt, were better placed to select good designs more than powerful lay patrons. And so, the famous architects George Frederick Bodley, who had just designed Washington Cathedral, pictured here, and Richard Norman Shaw were announced as assessors for the competition instead. Norman Shaw, an arts and crafts architect in his last years pioneering a classical Queen Anne revival, was an ideal candidate. He wrote in 1902 that, quote, "we were all intensely Gothic and intensely wrong." As a result of the Architectural Review's campaign, the Gothic stipulation was removed and the competition period extended. Of 102 portfolios, 85 of which had come from Britain, there were in the end very few classical submissions. A short list of 5 was drawn up, and the eventual winner was a young Giles Gilbert Scott, then just 22 years old, and a scion of the eminent Victorian architectural dynasty of Gothic revivalists. And what did he produce after all that fuss? Well, no less than a Gothic cathedral, with 2 imposing towers and a conventional cruciform plan. I'm showing you a section of the competition design. Because of Scott's youth, he was yoked together with the ageing Bodley to supervise the design and construction. And this unhappy partnership was, for Scott, mercifully brought to an end when Bodley died in 1907. By then only the Lady Chapel had been built, and Scott, now appointed sole architect, seized the opportunity to radically alter the design. By 1909 he had produced a new scheme. The 2 central towers and single transepts which dominated the initial proposals were inverted so that there was now one single great tower of 280 feet and double transepts, with the truncation of the nave from 6 bays to 3, as we have in the design as built. The building, as Hope Bagnall, the acoustics expert, wrote in 1921, was, quote, composed of well-known elements about a new focal point, namely the central tower, rather than the east end. This central space, shown under construction here, 72 by 200 feet, is formed by the tower crossing and placed the worshipper right in the centre of the action, achieving a unique unity to the design. And the building in Woolton red sandstone, seen in the perspective on the previous slide on the right, gave it its distinct pinkish tone, enlivened by white pointing between the ashlar blocks. But was it really a Gothic design? Well, arguably, the building was repeatedly praised all throughout its construction for somehow eluding style, for being meaningfully modern in its handling not only of mass and volume, but also detailing. John Summerson, the architectural historian, wrote, for instance, that, quote, "there is perhaps no building in the world which reflects on a comparable scale the changing mentality of a generation focused at the drawing board of one man." And Joe Morden-Crook has noted how, again, quote, "over a period of 3/4 of a century, the style of decoration changed from English to Spanish, and from archaeological to abstract, from neo-Gothic to neon-Gothic." Indeed, the classical and symmetrical church plan, with the typically Anglican focus on creating cathedral spaces where all could see and hear, much like Wren's St. Paul's, belied the seemingly Gothic exterior, itself a stylized perpendicular or late Gothic. In other words, Scott as a designer and the critics commentating on him were all constrained by the language of style while desperately trying to wriggle free of it. Style had become a kind of straitjacket. The question, in what style shall we build, was now felt to be outdated and irrelevant. Architects were searching for the emergence of a new mode of architectural expression appropriate for their own age. So what does all this tell us? It all may seem very remote from the interwar years, which is the subject of this lecture. This was a competition, after all, that was concluded 15 years before the end of the Great War. And my opening example of big church architecture may suggest to you that I'm that sort of architectural historian, all church plans and country houses. But the competition for Liverpool Anglican Cathedral, the interior of which you must, if you haven't already, go and see, introduces some of the big themes and ideas to be discussed over the next hour and a half or so. To begin with, it places Liverpool right at the centre of our story. And indeed, Liverpool and its school of architecture, led by Charles Herbert Riley, shown on the left, was at the very epicenter of the key architectural debates of the first half of the 20th century. And there's an image of the studio at the Liverpool School in the 1930s, and below an exhibition of the Liverpool School of Architecture's work at the new headquarters of the RIBA in 1935. And the school produced architects who went about designing buildings not only all over the country, but all over the British Empire. Secondly, it introduces Giles Gilbert Scott, another protagonist in our story, a man who went on to design major monuments of the period, like the new University Library for Cambridge, Battersea, and Bankside power stations, now the latter now the Tate Modern, and Waterloo Bridge, but who also bequeathed us the ubiquitous red telephone box, which continues to animate the public realm today. Thirdly, it immediately challenges the rigidity of periodization. Life in interwar Britain did not begin in 1918, nor did the world transform simplistically after 1945. Currents of design practice, of architectural theory and criticism and so on evolved from the 19th century and carried forward into the mid-20th. Liverpool Cathedral itself was not complete until 1978. In other words, it spans the whole of our period and exceeds it. And finally, this opening vignette, I hope, starts to move us on from this tricky issue of style, which tends to be the way interwar architectural history is told. It's fine.
Oh, that's all right. Sorry.
It suggests that this eschewing of style, this discomfort with the language of style, was felt by contemporaries to be something new and meaningful. It sounds, does it not, radical and modern, and yet this was a question being grappled by precisely the sorts of architects that modernists came to dismiss as traditionalists and historicists, as too concerned with facadist details to grapple with new possibilities of spatial disposition and the new requirements of rapidly and radically changing industrialized society. But style, or more importantly form, is still pertinent because it mattered to some of the people we'll be discussing. My argument is simply that it didn't obsess them in a way that historians have thought, and that it didn't, or at least shouldn't, determine not only what is interesting to historians, but more importantly what is of value to you as future professionals and practitioners. So you'll see a variety of different architectural languages, Neo-Georgian, Tudoresque, modern, and modernist, across a number of different typologies. The normal account of interwar architecture is to emphasize either the irreconcilability of these styles with the experience of modernity, to see retrenchment or whimsical fantasy in them, or conversely to look at the futile attempt by some of the age's leading architects precisely to reconcile traditional architecture with the modern, what was often evoked as the middle line or golden mean between these so-called polarizing forces. What I want to do instead is establish right from the start that all of these buildings are modern, all took place under the register of modernity, and all should be understood as valid architectural expressions. Understanding them on their own terms, I think, makes them part of the rich and complex story of 20th century architecture and helps you, perhaps to understand what lessons they hold for the future of architectural design. So this lecture is not about style, but it is about buildings, and we're going to look at a lot of them, probably too many, but in a way that highlights the social and political aspects of architectural culture. What I won't have time to do, simply because our subject is too big to deal with in just one lecture, is introduce some of the other things which architects were doing in the interwar years, what else they thought was part of their job description. But I'll mention them very briefly here, really by way of encouragement, a sort of teaser to go away and find out more. Architects, for instance, particularly if you were trained here in the interwar years, in the Liverpool School, were interested not just in individual buildings as they felt their Victorian forebears had been, but also in planning. There was such a thing as the architect planner at this time. We just don't often hear about it. At Liverpool, town planning was called civic design, and the best and most readable material on civic design is written by Arthur Tristan Edwards, who was also a student here in the 1910s, and pick up his rather eccentric Good and Bad Manners in Architecture, published in 1924, and you'll start to understand what I mean. And there were a number of major pitched battles in planning in which architecture participated. The creation of a new road in London, Kingsway, or the rebuilding of an old one, Regent Street, or the carving out of an arterial road network to relieve congestion in cities, along which many of the factories of light industry congregated, and beyond which rows and rows of suburban housing were laid out in ribbons that you can see in the bottom image here. What had been there before were largely open fields and agriculture seen in the upper image, and this was another abiding concern of the period's architects, the preservation of rural England, and the assault on the countryside by what contemporaries called villadom, i.e. suburban sprawl. For this, you should turn to Clough Williams-Ellis's England and the Octopus, which led to the establishment of the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, the CPRE, or Thomas Sharp's Town and Countryside, which argued that the salvation of the countryside was a clearer, more forcefully pro-urban vision of the city and what the city should be. These questions are, of course, particularly pertinent when we face the current dilemma about building on the Greenbelt, for instance. But it was not just landscape which was actively preserved by the architectural community, it was monuments too. And alas, we will not have time to think about how architects fought, and fought each other, especially over the preservation of their architectural heritage. This was a period in which we lost John Soane's Bank of England, shown here on the left and under demolition on the right, Nash's Regent Street, again the old street on the left, the new being demolished and replaced on the right, the Adam Brothers Adelphi Terraces on the riverside in central London, and John Rennie's Waterloo Bridge. Many other monuments and buildings all over the country were also pulled down during this period. All I will say on this is I would urge you to think of this preservation sensibility not as a kind of NIMBY-ish barrier to progress and a sort of fustiness, but to understand how the 1920s and 1930s, particularly among many arguing for the retention of Georgian-built heritage, understood preservation and development to be intermixed, and to open up the possibility of dynamic contrast and reframing in the urban scene, rather than just pastiche and copyism. Bearing all this in mind, I hope what emerges is some impression of what doing architecture, or doing design, to put it more capaciously, looked like in the interwar years. So let's begin in earnest. I said earlier that life in interwar Britain did not begin suddenly in 1918. It had, though, of course, for over 1 million, mainly young men, by then ended. And that was a fact not quickly forgotten by their friends, their families, and those who served beside them and survived in the Great War. The architecture of memorials, particularly those initiated by the Imperial War Graves Commission, established in 1917, had an immense effect on the architecture of the interwar years. Architects played an essential role in finding the appropriate visual and spatial language to express loss, a loss almost inestimable, were it not indeed for the War Graves Commission, which so carefully sought to record the missing and the dead, not just the officers, but the ordinary privates, and not just the English, Welsh, Scots and Irish, but also the Africans, Indians, Canadian, Australians and others of various creeds and colours, who fought not just for king and country, but in the name of empire too. As Gavin Stamper's written, quote, "The war memorial, one that commemorated not a victory or a victorious commander, but human sacrifice, was a comparatively new conception which had emerged in the previous 19th century. Indeed, before the Great War, Great Britain erected no significant national war memorials. There is no single national monument commemorating the Boer War, but only local and regimental memorials. British architects had, however, been enlisted to memorialise the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902 in South Africa itself. The notorious imperialist Cecil Rhodes, shown here in cartoon on the left and in statue form, we'll come back to this image later, on the right, founder of the De Beers Diamond Mining Company, commissioned the architect Herbert Baker, who had been living in South Africa in the early 20th century, to design a monument to the fallen British fighters of the Siege of Kimberley, where the operational headquarters of De Beers was located. Rhodes had been Prime Minister of Cape Colony, one of the 4 British South African colonies which would later constitute the United Dominion of South Africa, and had been behind the Jameson Raid, which had kick-started the Second Boer War. And his problematic presence in Kimberley as the Boers rounded on the town had made matters worse and not better. So in part to atone for this, Rhodes bankrolled Baker's travel round the monuments and temples of the ancient world in Italy, Greece and Egypt in order, quote, to formulate an adequate commemorative response to those who had fallen. The resulting memorial, completed in 1904 to the honoured dead, a tetrastyle classical temple raised on a tall podium, has been described by Alex Bremner as, quote, prefiguring in its elemental geometry the memorials to the slaughter of World War I. Rhodes and Baker's association led to Baker's commission for the Union Buildings of Pretoria, the administrative centre and commemorative complex to the unification of the Cape Colony and Boer republics, built between 1910 and 1913. This commission, in turn, led to Baker's invitation to join Edward Lutyens as one of the 3 architectural expert consultants to the Town Planning Committee in New Delhi. Lutyens had also worked in South Africa. He had been commissioned to design the Rand Regiment's Memorial, now known as the Anglo-Boer War Memorial in Johannesburg, in 1911, which was completed by the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. And this double-arch structure on 2 axes prefigured the employment of monumental memorial arches after the Great War, in particular the famous memorial to the missing of the Somme at Thiepval, built between 1928 and 1932. Lutyens, born in 1869 and died in 1944, was in his day considered the greatest living architect since Sir Christopher Wren. A typical Lutyenesque coining, the Renaissance, encapsulates neatly the great debt the Edwardian and indeed interwar generations felt to the architecture of Wren and the English Baroque. On the left is a dome from the Belfast City Hall by Alfred Brumwell Thomas, and on the right is a portion of Wren's Greenwich Hospital, but I could easily have chosen the Port of Liverpool building, for instance, as a comparison. Having established a career as the consummate arts and crafts architect of housing for the Edwardian nouveau riche, by the start of the 20th century, he was increasingly drawn towards classicism and the architecture of the Renaissance. And one of his first attempts in this new direction was offices for the magazine Country Life, 1904 to 1906, on Tavistock Street, a title which should ironically help to secure his preeminence in the vernacular domestic sphere. The grandstanding Edwardian Baroque produced by Lutyens and many of his contemporaries was an architecture felt to be fit for the greatest empire the world had supposedly ever seen, and architects and buildings played an important but still perhaps little understood role in fashioning the image of late imperial Britain and in reimagining its administration and commerce. The best known example of this is, of course, the building of New Delhi, when, during the famous Delhi Durbar in 1911, George V decreed that the capital of the British Raj was moved from Calcutta to Delhi, the historic capital of the Mughal Empire, which had preceded the advent of the British. Here, Lutyens, who sat on the Delhi Town Planning Committee, won the commission to settle the layout of the new capital on grand axial lines, inspired by the Beaux-Arts, and to design the Viceroy's Palace, now the Rashtrapati Bhavan, a building which combined Eastern and Western classical elements, including its famous dome. The work, stalled because of war in around 1917, were not completed until 1929, and Herbert Baker was the other significant player in the laying out of New Delhi, and as the burden of Lutyens' work increased, he designed the neighbouring Secretariat buildings. As work on New Delhi stalled in 1917, Lutyens and Baker, now having finished work in South Africa, were invited by Sir Fabian Ware, a journalist and colonial administrator, who had indeed been active in the South African colonies, to consult for the newly established Imperial War Graves Commission. And for this body, Lutyens helped to determine the basic layout for the Stone of Remembrance, which were sort of secular altars placed in all imperial war graves with over 1,000 burials, and in many villages and towns across the country. The secular nature of these memorials was particularly controversial by the Anglican Church especially, but Lutyens was highly sensitive to the fact that these mass graveyards were for soldiers, as I said, of all denominations and none from across the British Empire, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, Roman Catholics and atheists, not just Anglicans. And this aspiration chimed with Ware, who had successfully banned the repatriation of bodies from the front and established the premise that there would be no private memorials. Headstones, shown here, would be uniform, bearing only the name of the soldier, his military class, regiment, and any relevant religious symbols. And this was intended to democratize the memorialization of the dead. These mass cemeteries, uniform and neatly arranged and profoundly architectural, were silent cities, as the late Gavin Stamp described them in a pioneering exhibition on this subject in the late 1970s. This whole enterprise of memorialization in the First World War was a relatively new concept because so many ordinary men were called up to fight and were killed. Memorials had, of course, tended to be for military victory. Here's the Arc de Triomphe. or in Britain, the Marble Arch, designed by John Nash and originally in front of Buckingham Palace. The secular and democratic mode, which Lutyens helped to establish, had its fullest expression in the design of the Cenotaph on Whitehall in London. Originally, this was a temporary structure of wood and plaster painted to look like stone, seen on the left for the Peace Day celebrations in 1919, but was eventually replaced with the permanent Portland stone version we see today. But the greatest statements of memorialization were the great arches constructed in the 1920s and into the early 1930s, and we'll focus just on two. The Menin Gate, a memorial to the fallen of Ypres by Reginald Bloomfield, and the memorial to the missing of the Somme, the Thiepval Memorial Archway by Lutyens. In these two examples, we see the major trends in British interwar architecture in formal terms. The interplay of mass and volume in the stepped, almost pyramidal structure of interlocking arches in Lutyens' Thiepval monument, and the more cautious, austere and conventional Menin Gate by Bloomfield. So we'll take Bloomfield briefly first. Despite the depth of the processional gateway, you can see that there's a kind of flatness in Bloomfield's work, not just here, but also in many of his projects, which demonstrates his kind of academic classicism. It's seen, for instance, in the facades of Regent Street, or in the Hedrow Parade in Leeds depicted here. And this was a common feature of interwar architecture, particularly as architects were tested by the arrival of the steel frame. But it wasn't just a lack of technical imagination. Sometimes, facadism, the integrity of the streetscape, the muted and the ornamental in the grand manner, as Bloomfield liked to call it, had genuine intellectual integrity behind it, even if we struggle to see it now. I mentioned earlier the book Good and Bad Manners in Architecture, and I repeat that this is a book worth reading to start to understand this point of view. Thiepval was something altogether different. Here, Lutyens produced a sophisticated essay in the triumphal arch theme that he had begun exploring in that early memorial to the Rand Regiment, and in the India Gate, or All India War Memorial in New Delhi, that combines the sort of basic pylon blocking of the cenotaph on a grand scale, with a dramatic triumphal archway cutting through on two axes. For a brilliantly concise and punchy account of Lutyens at Thiepval, the book to read is Gavin Stamp's Memorial to the Missing of the Somme. And in that book, he draws attention to the use of the interlocking arch spatial motif in Lutyens' unbuilt magnum opus, the Roman Catholic cathedral intended for Liverpool, of which only the crypt was built. The governing idea for the interior, Stamp writes, was that the hierarchy of arches along two axes that was realised at Thiepval, except that here the nave and aisles were to be 3 times as high as their width, given an almost Gothic proportion. The Second War led to the cancellation of this project, and in the end, Gibbard's crown concrete cone was put up in the 1960s. But in all of these projects, especially in the Cenotaph at Thiepval and the Catholic Cathedral, Lutyens was aiming after something elusive, something almost transcendental, with a universal quality that he described as the elemental. And it is this aspect of the memorial mode which had the most significant impact on British architecture throughout the rest of the 1920s and 30s. We've already seen another manifestation of this ideal in Scott's Great Crossing at the Anglican Cathedral at Liverpool, and Scott indeed explored the universal in his monumental architecture in all the major public and commercial buildings of his career, with a similar careful attention to massing. Charles Holden, who designed the sublime and monumental headquarters for the London Underground on the left, and the Senate House for the University of London on the right, also strove after this quality. Indeed, his biographer Aiton Carroll uses this particular term, the elemental. He sought out an architecture, quote, so inseparable from structure that nothing could be left out, which rather than relying on ornamental, would be founded on those more permanent basic factors of architecture, the plan and the planes and the masses arising out of the plan. And Holden, incidentally, had been transferred to the Imperial War Graves Commission, so he worked with Lutyens and became the 4th official architect alongside Baker Bloomfield and Lutyens in 1920. So what I want to suggest to you is that whether or not you like this stuff very much, it's worth thinking about, at least in this context, for 2 main reasons. First of all, we've seen how all of this work was bound up in the late British imperial project. And this is a topic that we still don't really talk about very openly, often enough. So I've tried to show you how bound up the interwar years are with the story of empire, and how architecture and the built environment were often absolutely central to that enterprise. Baker was Rhodes's architect, and they were united in a proudly pro-empire enterprise. Baker also designed 2 high commissions for India and South Africa in central London in the interwar period too. I showed you earlier an image of a statue of Rhodes at the University of Cape Town being pulled down triumphantly by protesters participating in the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And this movement aimed to negotiate, this is just 3 or 4 years ago, to negotiate with the legacy of colonialism through the decolonisation of the campus and the removal of the symbols of eulogies of imperial rule in urban form. A connected movement emerged in Oxford, another city in which Rhodes's legacy and the legacies of slavery are ubiquitous. And it makes it clear to me the ways in which architecture and conservation and heritage and architectural history can actually be intensely political. An article on the architecture of empire written by Baker argued, for instance, for the development of the symbolical architecture. Quote, if on the full realization of full imperial union we have, as is to be hoped, an imperial capital, let it consist of a building which with its surroundings may be truly expressive of all that is best in empire, in the past as well as in the present of empire. And it's in the mission of the architect, he said, as of the poet, to give outward expression to national ideals, to turn them, to shape and give them a local habitation and a name throughout the empire. So this is a sort of weird and intensely ardent belief in the value of empire and the subjugation of different people. So I leave that as a sort of lingering provocation, because I think on an obvious level it shows how imperialism permeated architectural culture, but it also shows some of the difficulties in dealing with heritage in this area. And on an even wider scale, it reminds us, I think, of the political responsibilities of the designer. If we want inclusivity and diversity in urban and architectural form, there are some difficult questions here to grapple with, particularly for conservation, traditionalist and commercial architects, as some of you, it may turn out to be in due course, will become. We'll come back to empire later on. So I've dwelt on the design of war memorials, and these examples in particular, because they helpfully introduce you to 3 of the most important figures in the architectural world of the interwar period: Lutyens, Bloomfield and Baker. Lutyens is much loved by architects of all persuasions, modernists and traditionalists alike still. The other 2, Bloomfield and Baker, are now relatively unknown and considered rather mediocre architects. I suggested to you that in the mainstream of architectural practice there were 2 broad design tendencies. The first was this inherently 3-dimensional approach to design, of which Lutyens was the supreme example. But the powerful massing setbacks, towers and grand spaces was also prevalent in a number of the leading architects of the day. Vincent Harris, a Lutyens aficionado, but who probably was the most successful architect of public buildings, especially town halls and civic centres, also explored the possibilities of expressing mass and volume, more often than not with a classical dress. This is Sheffield Memorial Hall. Ernest Berry Webber, his best-known pupil, also shows this. This is Southampton Civic Centre. And this method of composition owed something to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, indeed where many American classicists of the early 20th century had studied, and which strongly influenced C.H. Riley's Liverpool School and some of its most successful students like Herbert J. Rouse. This is the George Dock Ventilation Tower. And it also influenced architects like Lewis and Davis, known for their design of the Ritz on Piccadilly, one of the first steel-frame constructed buildings in the country. And Arthur Davies had indeed studied at the École in Paris. Just up the road from this, there's another typical American building, the old Woolsey Car Showrooms, later a Barclays Bank and now a restaurant, the Ivy, designed by, the Woolsey, designed by William Curtis Green. And buildings like Bush House on the Aldwych, designed by Americans for American clients, is another example. Devonshire House, designed by Thomas Hastings of the American firm Carrere and Hastings with C.H. Riley as consultant architect, shows the presence of American design in interwar Britain, a theme perhaps to which you will return in your later lectures with Professor Jackson, with Neil Jackson. And many other buildings wore their debt to America on their sleeves. The monumentality of McKim, Mead and White. This is Penn Station in New York. The striking masses of Paul Cret, the modern Gothic of Bertram Goodhue, who had been influenced by Scott at Liverpool, the civic scale of Daniel Burnham, who built a white city for the Chicago World Exhibition in 1893. These all had major impacts on the commercial architecture of Britain between the wars, and this is unsurprising given America's growing economic and trade dominance in this period. But I think the important thing to take away from this is exchange. We did export one skyscraper architect of Manhattan, Alfred Bosham, and there were other genuine transatlantic exchanges too. Skyscrapers never quite took off. They were never thought to be appropriate to London. But there was a continuing debate, led unsurprisingly by commercial architects like a chap called Delisa Joseph, about taller buildings in London. Joseph's son, Ernest Joseph, built, for example, the Shelmet House on London's riverside, and this was soon to be neighboured by Calcott and Hamp's New Adelphi buildings, a commercial development which looks like a squat American hotel design, which lead architect Stanley Hamp had much admired on his travels there. This is the Pennsylvania Hotel, also by McKim, Mead and White. If I earlier dwelt on memorials for too long, it's because the memorial mode and the impact of war were immense on the decades that followed. Key to the characterization of the period, either as a morbid age, as it's sometimes called, or a long weekend. These are the names of some key accounts in social history of the period. They show very starkly the historical debate. On the one hand, British culture was obsessed with the perceived crisis in civilization and a sense of existential doom. The long shadow of the Great War was almost inescapable. But on the other hand, that this was a period in which, despite dramatic economic turbulence, particularly in the late 1920s, living standards rose, leisure time and amenity improved, thanks to the reduction of the working week, and there were new forms of entertainment that flourished thanks to film and radio. And housing standards for the working classes began to improve too. Memorials and the act of memorialization then was not just for the dead in the realm of the built environment, they were the first steps to reconstruction, and they reflected a growing democratization enshrined in the Representation of the People Act in 1918, which enfranchised all men over 21 and some women, as you will have heard recently, over the age of 30. Architecture and the improvement of urban environments in particular was therefore conceived as memorials to the service of the living. Memorial halls and public parks are all examples of this. But the major example was the Homes Fit for Heroes campaign, initiated by the Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George, as an act of memorialisation which formalised the growing tendency for the state to act as mass house builder. Not only that, but it reflected too a fear in the immediate post-war period of social revolution by working class people and the destabilising presence of demobilised former servicemen. There had been revolutions in Russia and Germany, for instance, that were massively disruptive. And these were there was felt to be a need to create a property-owning democracy, which is an idea I think we normally associate with the 1980s and Margaret Thatcher, but in fact was a phrase that was coined in the 1920s. Housing is a massive topic in interwar architectural history, and I can't really do justice to it here. So what I want to do is just give you a few examples before we break. Drawing in particular from Mark Swennerton's Homes Fit for Heroes, okay, which is the book to read to sort of get you started on interwar housing, as well as his book Building the New Jerusalem. And Simon Pepper and Peter Richmond, who are also based at the Liverpool School, work on interwar high-rise and slum clearance. So there's a lot of kind of excellent research that's come out of people attached to the department, which you should definitely engage with. And my headline message is, if you're doing studios on housing or crits where you want to include a bit of contextual information in your presentations, don't just jump straight to post-war tower blocks or low-rise high-density housing solutions of the 50s and 60s. And don't just think about housing through the lens of the welfare state. If you really want to kind of think critically about design and the role of the architect in a political context in which central government waxes lyrical about solutions to the housing crisis but actually does nothing, then look at the interwar years, because there's a lot of valuable lessons there. So I want to be really clear about what I want you to get out of this. Firstly, that the housing question has two essential aspects. There's the building of new housing, that's adding to the housing stock, And then there's the clearance of slums, so getting rid of old and unhealthy, dilapidated housing stock, and then what should replace them. But first we need to be very clear on what the Garden City movement did to housing design and housing standards in this country at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. So the second takeaway is about suburban housing, about neo-Tudor semis and neo-Georgian cottages or modern villas in suburbs outside all the major towns and cities in London, and we'll come back to those. And then the third is actually about the low-rise, high-density housing development in the interwar period, which is, I think, a really important aspect of housing typology and urban morphology, which isn't really discussed in the interwar period. These are, broadly speaking, questions about what housing should look like and where it should go. And that's absolutely central, obviously. But I also want you to think about delivery as we go through this. What were the different ways in which the interwar economy could get people, designers, politicians, and even lay people, what were the ways that they thought housing could raise building standards for the maximum number of people? Okay. In the 19th century, working class housing and housing for the poor was causing massive social and public health problems. Slums were a scourge on Victorian society. Architectural critics and theorists have been calling for improved dwellings, slum clearance and economic reform from the middle of the century. Ruskin is possibly the best known of these today, and he in turn inspired William Morris, the father of the arts and crafts movement, but there were many others, including George Godwin, who was a long-time editor of The Builder, and C.R. Ashby, who was involved in the settlement movement at Toynbee House in East London. And combined with social reformer Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement, these social, political and architectural movements birthed Raymond Unwin, a young engineer and committed socialist who published a book called The Art of Building a Home in 1901. And through Unwin, the Garden City movement and its ideals of low density, low rise open development came to exert a tremendous influence over early state housing policy. And in the 19th century, where housing development was seen as outside the remit of state control, it was only in the last quarter of the century that local authorities were legally empowered to clear slums and redevelop. And so you start to get things like this. This is a boundary estate in Shoreditch around Arnold Circus, built by the LCC, the London County Council, from the 1890s. And these sorts of housing were meant to be an improvement on the by-law street, where you would get incredibly narrow frontages on incredibly narrow streets with very intense densities of, let's say, somewhere between 30 to 40 dwellings to an acre. So what Howard did was he took a completely, Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement took a radically different view to housing reform, saying that the key barrier to good housing and quality of life was the city. So he said, abandon the city to satellite towns, which will be girdled by a green belt. This is partly where the idea of the green belt comes from. And that would combine the best of urban and rural life. If 41 dwellings to the acre was what the city offered, the Garden City movement advocated a density of more like 12 dwellings to an acre. And this is what a sort of ideal Garden City house by Unwin and his partner Barry Parker looked like at Letchworth in Hertfordshire, which was the first garden city, and that's the plan below. Unwin was also appointed to design Hampstead Garden Suburb in North London. And both of these enterprises aim to supply affordable housing at a low density. And this idea really took off, and by 1914 there were over 50 schemes being built along Garden City lines. But garden cities could also be model villages led by industry. So I'll just show you very quickly an example of Port Sunlight, which is near here. Here, William Lever, the soap magnate, moved his soap works from Warrington to Port Sunlight, 10 miles up and across the Mersey from here, in 1887. By 1907, he had 3,000 people in his soap factory and housed about 3,500 in the carefully planned company village shown here. When he arrived, there'd been about 28 houses, so that's in about 1889 in the top image, and by 1909 there were about 720. And this was all about providing welfare benefits to employees, about housing providing them with housing, profit sharing, pensions, sick benefit, and so on. And I'm offering these to you as a sort of provocation about, what should the massive modern corporation actually be supplying to its workers aside from 0 hours contracts. But what I want to do is I'll jump to this sort of another tradition in interwar housing, which kind of grew out of the Liverpool school here in the 1910s. And this came out of the sort of Beaux-Arts classicism of civic art or civic design, as I mentioned earlier. And it was Riley and his colleague Stanley Adshead, who was the first professor of civic design, who kind of propagated this idea from 1909. And some of the school's more influential students, like Tristan Edwards, who I've mentioned a couple of times, were involved in defining and disseminating this other approach to housing. The core of their message was that the Garden City's various strands promoted quasi-rural living, which combined supposedly the best of town and country. And these sort of highly romantic and individualistic homes with vernacular detailing in the arts and crafts tradition was kind of outdated. It wasn't supplying what people actually wanted, the sort of urban condition in which they wanted to live. So their position was much more forcefully pro-urban. If city life was broken, it should be fixed, not abandoned. And they preferred more formal composition and expression in the Georgian tradition, in terrace squares and crescents. I mentioned Port Suddenite earlier, and that was one of the first places that we can look to kind of trace this alternative tradition, where Riley designed a sort of pioneering crescent of neo-Regency cottages. And I'm showing you here some images from Dormanstown near Redcar, which is another sort of model village built by the Dorlonco steel company. And the point was that Adshead and Ramsey and Patrick Abercrombie, who was also at the Liverpool School, used the Dorlonco system to design these neo-Georgian cottages. Tristan Edwards, whom I mentioned earlier, would also come to champion high-density, low-rise housing, and he was a fierce critic of the Garden City movement. He felt that the best sort of city was one where the domestic and the civic kind of coexisted. And he used manners, this was his favourite phrase, as sort of pretext for urbanity, whereby buildings and people in cities show each other and their context a particular kind of deference. And these ideas were developed into a series of concrete proposals through the 100 New Towns Association, which he founded in 1933. And I'm showing you just the back cover of his, the first edition of his pamphlet, and then a map of how he proposed to scatter these 100 new towns. And you'll notice the sort of exclusion zone around London, whereas what the Garden City was saying was, let's build lots of satellite cities near London. He was saying, let's develop other parts of the country, in particular coastal cities, as you'll see. And he'd do this through a managed process of decentralization. And his type plans showed the adaptability of terraces and squares to different topographical situations. And he included type plans for houses too. And so you can see here, you can trace a sort of descent from this high-density, low-rise housing through people like Patrick Hodgkinson, and arguably through people like Neve Brown, and through Leslie Martin in the post-war period. They were all aware of Tristan Edwards and his pioneering work. So I think we can pause there. So we've sort of done the boring stuff, and we can move at a slightly faster pace. But I think it's worth just getting that sort of basic introduction into the big names and the big themes. I've given you then these quite lengthy case studies on Liverpool, on the architecture of memorials, and on housing. And that's helped me to explore 3 or possibly 4 of these really big themes in interwar architectural history. Style and the problematization of style in early 20th century architectural discourse and theory. Reconstruction, or rather the coming to terms with war and conflict. And additionally, I've kind of thrown in empire, or at least tried to make it present. And finally, democratization. How were architects involved in giving expression and recognition to an increasingly meaningful democratic society, which was making demands for better quality of life, better homes, and so on. So what I want to do for the rest of the lecture is to go at a slightly faster pace, looking at some other important typologies and projects through three broad thematics: the architecture of efficiency, the architecture of fancy, and the architecture of austerity, which I'm kind of posing as a question. These three themes, I think, speak to different ways of seeing the interwar period. Efficiency evokes the modernity of the period, the excitement of new technology and techniques, a streamlining reaction against the fustiness of the Edwardians and Victorians. Fancy conjures up the world of Evelyn Waugh's bright young things, the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age. And austerity, of course, refers to the typifying of the age as one of high unemployment and financial fluctuation, of parsimonious authority. And in all of these, I hope you'll see some parallels to questions that you face as designers today. To me, efficiency maps onto our own obsession with the transformative potential of the digital. Fancy, perhaps, onto our eclecticism and pluralism. And austerity links, I think, both to our generation's political reality and to in the questioning of it, the kind of growing progressive backlash against it. Oh, I have now lost. There we go. Efficiency. The interwar period has been characterized by Alan Powers as the age of efficiency. And it's true that efficiency was at first much more of a buzzword than functionalism, which no doubt you will have heard of and you'll hear more about in coming lectures. And here's Powers. The call for efficiency was answered with many solutions, combining old ideas of diligence and public service with new theories of mind, body, and the physical world. It was a practical, not an aesthetic movement, with the aim of putting Britain back in the first rank of industrial progress and expanding the role of the state in most areas of life. One of the fundamental justifications for modern architecture is its basis in new technology, one of the aspects of modernity that is normally assumed to lead to new formal solutions. It is, however, possible to adapt technology and disguise it in more familiar forms, which is broadly what happened in Britain between 1900 and 1930. And I think we started to see that in some of the examples of commercial architecture I showed you. The efficiency motif in architectural design and discourse then was about the expression not only of new technology, of labour-saving devices in the home, for example, but also about standardization and rationalization in industry, commerce, and even administration. How did it express itself in built form? Well, one word which I barely mentioned, but which you were probably expecting to hear a lot about, is modernism. The normal way of telling architectural history in the interwar period is to construct a story of pioneers, of people who had had some experiences abroad of modernist architecture who, for reasons of political exile or as subjects of imperial dominions, had ended up here, along with the occasional idiosyncratic maverick. What I've been offering you instead is a story of the mainstream of architectural design, but also one of the establishment. Modernist buildings began to appear in Britain from the 1920s, in part stimulated by the translation, for instance, of Corb's Towards a New Architecture by Frederick Etchells in 1927. But modernism had been of interest even before that. Christopher Hussey, editor of Country Life, if you remember the slightly fusty magazine I was describing earlier, for whom Lutyens designed headquarters building, Hussey, who wrote about Georgian architecture and the picturesque, nonetheless had started what he had called a Vers group in the early 20s to, quote, promote the Corbusian message. In the same year, after the editorial takeover of the Architectural Review and Architect's Journal by Hubert de Cronin Hastings and a band of modernist, sympathetic assistant editors and critics, they took the reins of the leading organs of architectural journalism, and this group later included the art historian Nicholas Pevsner, for instance, a German Jew who had fled Hitler's race laws. Other Jewish émigré architects included Ernst Freud, son of the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, Bertold Lebetkin, pictured here next to the canopy of High Point 1 in Highgate, and there's an aerial view of High Point 1 too, and Erno Goldfinger, whose Willow Road in Hampstead is pictured here. And there's Goldfinger at the bottom. Many of these architects worked on domestic commissions in and around Hampstead, mixing with artists, musicians and other cultural figures and contributing greatly to the dissemination of new ideas in design. Eric Mendelssohn, whose reputation as the leader of the modern movement had eclipsed Corb's in 1920s Britain, also fled here in the mid-1930s. And I'm just showing you two cartoons of his which were used, two sketches of his which were used on the AA's exhibition of his work in 1930, where he came, amidst great pomp and ceremony to lecture on architecture of our own times to the Architectural Association. This is not to say, however, that there weren't other means of new ideas spreading through publications like the Architectural Review, but smaller magazines as well, influential clients and emigres like Wells Coates from Canada via Japan, who designed the Isokon flats at Lawn Road, also in Hampstead, where, incidentally, Walter Gropius lived briefly, also after fleeing the Nazis. This development was commissioned by Jack Pritchard, the furniture businessman who worked with Marcel Breuer, a Hungarian émigré pictured on the left, and that's Pritchard's an image of Pritchard's penthouse flat at Isokon, and the plant stand, the metal plant stand at the back was designed by Breuer, and Breuer designed plywood furniture for Pritchard's firm. There was also Amias Connell from New Zealand, who later formed a successful partnership as Connell, Ward and Lucas, and Reginald Uren, another Kiwi, who designed the first modernist town hall in Hornsey in the mid-1930s. These are two images by Dell and Wainwright, the great photographers of the Architectural Review, and you should look up Robert Elwall's work on modernist architectural photography if you're interested in the visual style. Raymond McGraw, an Australian-born and known for designing a shimmering modernist interior, Finella, for the Cambridge Don Mansfield Forbes, shown the corridor of which is shown left and right of McGraw in the middle. And Serge Chermayeff, Russian-born but a naturalized Englishman who had studied at Harrow. Chermayeff, indeed, in the mid-1930s, ended up in partnership with Mendelssohn, and the two designed a striking Delaware pavilion in Bexhill in Sussex, shown a photograph here and in plan, as well as some domestic commissions leading up to 1936. What's worth noting, and which requires further research, is again kind of picking up this earlier motif of how many of these modernists were imperial subjects, born in Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and who, though politically progressive and involved in artistically avant-garde circles, were drawn to the imperial metropolis in spite of its perceived fustiness and traditionalism. So there is something that needs further working out here. Many others came from dominions and colonies like Esther Mo Yao Yen and Angeline Yen Mo Ting, both Malaysian, who studied at the Architectural Association in the 1930s. As the AA times 100 Women in Architecture exhibition has shown, there was a small but highly active female presence at this school from 1913. And in the interwar years, Jane Drew, for instance, pictured here with her husband, second husband, Max Fry, active in the debate about Reconstruction during the Second World War, and was also involved, went on in the post-war period to have a successful partnership with Fry, and they were famous for their tropical modernism in West Africa and in India at Chandigarh with Corbusier, and you should read Jessica Holland and Ian Jackson's excellent book on Fry and Drew to learn more. Also at the AA in the interwar years, though slightly earlier than Drew, was Elizabeth Scott, a cousin of Sir Giles Scott, who secured her place in history as the first woman on her own to win a major competition in the form of the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre at Stratford, opened in 1928, and strongly influenced by recent trends in Scandinavian architecture. Regular trips to Stockholm and Holland were held by the Architectural Association in the 1920s, and these had an enormous impact on English modernism in the interwar years. Renjar Ostberg's Stockholm City Hall, for instance, you can see it, in Uren's Hornsey Town Hall and in many town halls and public buildings around the country. And Tengbom's Stockholm Concert Hall you also see in design motifs, actually in some examples later on. There was then a significant network of English modernists and modernist ideas active in the interwar years, and which intermixed with prevailing trends and practices. And that's the crucial message that I want to impart or suggest to you. Not just avowed modernists were interested in modern ideas, and modernists were not impervious to wider architectural culture. This is perhaps particularly true of some of the British-born modernists, like Max Fry, just mentioned above, who was educated also in this school, and who was turned to the new architecture by Wells Coates, whom he had met whilst working in the planning practice of Thomas Adams and Francis Longstreth Thompson. And Thompson had cut his teeth under Unwin in the Ministry of Health's housing department, in the government housing scheme. So this is an incredibly intricately interlinked world of planning and architecture. There was also Frederick Gibbard, another architect who understood planning and who designed Pullman Court in Streatham, which opened in 1937. And this block of flats featured labour-saving devices and new technology like gas fires, wireless radio sets, and a built-in icebox. So here's this idea of efficiency in the home. And Gibbard went on, of course, to design Harlow Newtown and the Roman Catholic Cathedral, which I've already shown you. Many of these modernists were active in the Modern Architectural Research Group, founded in 1933 as the UK chapter of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, CIAM. And this is an image of the Mars Group. You can see with Korb and Wells Coates to the right, Chermayeff second from the right, and Max Fry on the far right there. Coates, Chermayeff and McGraw were particularly active in this group, as well as a number of important critics, including the architectural historian John Summerson, the journalist and later editor of the Architectural Review, Jim J.M. Richards, and FRS K. York, who published an influential book, The Modern House, in 1934, and who served as secretary of the group. Mars was particularly influential in the dissemination of modern ideas, especially in domestic architecture. What has come through, I think, from this whistle-stop tour of British modernism is how tied up with the domestic sphere these architects were. This is partly because, on the one hand, they required wealthy and enlightened clients who gave them domestic commissions, and on the other, because of the political progressivism inherent in their ideas, which made social housing and labour-saving devices for women, for instance, a central part of their interests. Elizabeth Darling has shown how the Mars Group should be seen as the summation of a number of efforts in the early 1920s, redressing the imbalance of attention by historians given to the 1930s. And I hope also in this, you will have felt the due emphasis on the 10s and the 20s as part of a continuous story. The Mars Group engaged in propaganda activities. They organised the new architecture exhibition, for instance, in London in 1938, and these are three views of that exhibition. You can see the Mars Group standing in front of that opening panel, showing the new interpretations of the sort of Vitruvian formula, commodity, firmness and delight, examples of new technology in prefabrication and rationalized assembly in the middle there, and then form and purpose. Okay, so again, this idea of efficiency prevalent in modernism, as well as designers active in the Neo-Georgian, for instance. The Mars were also engaged in exploiting new techniques of propaganda, such as the medium of radio. In the interwar period, as Shundana Yusuf has shown in a book called Broadcasting Buildings, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, broadcast talks and debates on architecture, in particular by leading modernist architects, and these were fairly frequent. One such famous debate was between Amias Connell and Reginald Bloomfield, increasingly curmudgeonly in his older years, on the merits of architectural modernism. It was not just through the airwaves that the BBC became a beacon, or should I say broadcaster, for architectural modernism. It was through design too. Radio was, of course, at this time, a relatively new medium. A television broadcast, really important to remember, did not begin until 1936. And the new corporation quickly outgrew its premises at Savoy Hill as early as 1926 and began searching for a new site in central London. And they settled on a site just up the road from Oxford Circus at the join of Regent Street and Portland Place. You can see it highlighted there in the middle. There's Regent's Park further up the top, and Hyde Park and St James's Park and Green Park in the belt below, just for context. Broadcasting House, their new headquarters, was opened in 1932. The building has a particular significance because its exterior encapsulates so much of what was typical about interwar architectural design. And not only that, but the client was characteristic of this period too. The BBC had begun life as a commercial cartel of radio manufacturers, licensed by the General Post Office, which was then a government department, to broadcast. It was government then that asked this cartel, the British Broadcasting Company, as it was founded, to come together to coordinate its interests and produce a coherent broadcasting programme. And this was to contrast with the scene in the US, where you had a number of private commercial stations competing with each other, as you still do, which was felt to have kind of compromised the quality of broadcasts. That's where the BBC comes from. And a license fee, the license fee we still pay, was placed on all receivers, half of which was given to the company to fund its broadcasting activities. So this semi-public arrangement of commercial cooperation was typical of the interwar years, and under the direction of John Reith was instilled with a particular public service ethos, and broadcasting was conceived from very early on as a public utility. And again, I'm kind of labouring that point because we have seen in recent weeks and months, the kind of the problematic association of the public sphere and the private sphere. And we've kind of ended up in this very polarised situation where it's either you're completely in favour of the private sphere delivering things, delivering construction, in the case of Carillion, or the public sphere. In the interwar period, there was a sort of this kind of new and unique compromise. And the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, was re-established as the British Broadcasting Corporation with this new national service mandate in mind. So how was this new sort of administration and this new sort of democratic service to be expressed in architectural form? Well, again, the building is typical. Essentially, the BBC were obliged to inherit what would otherwise have been a fairly typical pedestrian commercial office block developed by a now anonymous syndicate of private developers. In other words, the site that they settled on had already been bought by a group of developers who had started to develop a sort of generic office block. And the BBC entered into an agreement whereby they would take on the freehold once the developers had completed construction. So they had to use the developer's architect. And it's for this reason that they ended up with Lieutenant Colonel George Val Meyer, who produced an exterior using streamlined modern forms in Portland stone dressed in a steel frame with nods to Neo-Georgian design in the use of individual casement windows, which you can see. But within the bowels of this solid and stolid ocean liner-like exterior was a more radical and expressive interior. Broadcasting House is effectively two buildings in one. An exterior ring of administrative offices separated by a corridor or an acoustic moat, as one critic described it, from a brick-built windowless central core that housed soundproof studios with accompanying lounges and waiting rooms. So this just shows you the steel frame outer ring and the rising Portland stone cladding at the base, and you can just see the in the centre there the block of what would become Eric Gill's Ariel and Prospero, the famous sculptural group at the front. There were 20 studios, including a 3-storey concert hall designed by Val Meyer and a chapel-like studio for religious broadcast by Edward Morph, designer of Guildford Cathedral, which we'll see in a moment. The rest of the interiors, however, were free from Val Meyer's control, thanks to the coordinating role of a man called V.H. Goldsmith, who was chairman of the Studio Decoration Committee convened in 1929. As Goldsmith recounted, the style of the treatment of the interior of Broadcasting House, I'll just show you some images here, was first for settlement. That such a question should arise at all was an indication that the house would not fall into the hands of the period decorator, as is so often the case then, when there is a lack of particular interest in the visual arts. Once the matter was raised for debate, the logical and practical arguments alone were bound to convert to modernism those accustomed to controlling a medium demanding so much freshness of outlook as broadcasting. You can see on the bottom right there, is Morph's chapel studio, which is probably the most conservative of the interiors in Broadcasting House. McGraw was the coordinator of a band of young modernists, including Wells Coates and Chermayeff. McGraw helped to standardise fittings like telephones, signal lights, chairs, mic stands, door lettering and signposting. Wells Coates' rooms were considered to be the best. He helped coordinate the technical tools and equipment with the studio furniture, using modern materials like tubular steel and anodised aluminium, laminated wood paint and lavender grey cellulose lacquer. There were metaphors from aviation too, the new modern means of transport in these studios, such as the dramatic control panels, seen below, a form of sort of primitive mixing desk, which was meant to evoke the cockpit of an aeroplane. The normal account of this building is, therefore, that it shows perfectly the great clash of architectural style, to go back to that Vex term, in the interwar period, and the changing of the guard from unadventurous architects like Ballmeyer to more ambitious avant-gardists like McGraw and Coates. And there's an element of truth in this. Ballmeyer, an oversensitive man who by pure accident had landed on the biggest job of his career, undoubtedly resented the young Turks of the modernist camp. But this was as much about institutional politics as it was about a new battle of styles among architects. A more useful way of conceiving of all of this, I think, is as a tension between individualism or eccentricity and the need to express the corporation and collective endeavour, between, in a sense, the private and the public. And this is something we see time and time again in the interwar period. Through Frank Pick, the managing director of the London Underground, who worked with Charles Holden on extensions to the Northern and Piccadilly lines, as well as for their headquarters at 55 Broadway in Westminster, which we've already seen, a building that's rather similar to Broadcasting House in many ways. There's Holden top left and Frank Pick on the right, and a model of Balham Station, one of the Northern Line stations extending south. It's also seen in the rationalisation of electricity in the interwar period. Electricity provision had been at first a private and then a municipal enterprise, but the need for a coordinated national grid led to the need for a network of electricity pylons designed by Reginald Bloomfield, again in his older age, morphing into more and more sort of gangster image, or the coalescing of the London electricity interests into the London Power Company in 1925, who then commissioned Giles Gilbert Scott to dress up their engineers' designs for a new power station at Battersea. And what I find really interesting in all of this is the architecture profession's interest in these projects, because they didn't necessarily need to be, or clients didn't necessarily need architects. Architects were there to negotiate this sort of public part of the commission as much as the private wishes of the client. Much of this attitude of the efficiency theme in interwar architectural history can be expressed by one of Frank Pick's famous maxims, fitness for purpose, which was in fact the clarion call of the Design and Industries Association, a body founded in 1915, again, to see these sort of pre-war or wartime continuities, to promote British industrial design, and which brought under its fold not only people of the arts and crafts, but also people like Pick, people like Pritchard, and people like Chermayeff and Wells Coates. And it also involved an intriguing figure in interwar culture, Lawrence Weaver. And Weaver allows me to neatly segue into the second thematic, architecture and fancy, through his involvement with the British Empire Exhibition. And there's a picture of Weaver. The British Empire Exhibition ran across 2 seasons in 1924 and 1925, and it was one of a number of strategies initiated or supported by government to stimulate inter-imperial trade, a major political preoccupation of the day, which we needn't go into now. John Simpson and Maxwell Ayrton were the architects of the exhibition, with the engineer Owen Williams, who designed the D10 boots factory in Nottingham, which is well worth looking up if you don't know it, as consultant engineer. They designed the old Wembley Stadium, famous for its twin towers, and the main palaces of industry and engineering, with arts put in, Palace of Arts in the second season. So you can see the broad layout, again, a typical sort of Beaux-Arts axial layout, much like New Delhi, much like Burnham's plan for Chicago, which we saw earlier, and at the bottom on the left and on the far left of the right-hand image, you can see the old Wembley Stadium, and these were aerial photographs, aerial photography, another great new medium of the interwar years, shown with the wing of the plane in the way of the lens there. These were all in Beaux-Arts classical style, as I've just said, but built out of concrete. Okay, so there is, as we saw in Alan Powers' quotation earlier, this interest in new materials, even if using old forms. A number of pavilions were designed by various architects for different colonies and dominions. These are just some more images of the Palace of Industry and the Palace of Arts. And in some instances were highly problematic. These are the sort of primitive pavilions of the African colonies, and there were also particularly ugly spectacles like native villages, so that they effectively imported tribes people to perform tribal ritual for gawping at visiting British tourists. I bring Wembley to your attention because despite the fact that historians have largely neglected it, it was a huge event, and crucially an architectural one as much as anything else. And you will have noticed, I repeat that I've stressed time and time again how architects and architecture were all subjects of the British Empire. The Empire Exhibition attracted 17 million people in the first year of its operation, and though it had an anticipated audience of 25 million, that's still an enormous number, and they traversed an 88-hectare site with gardens, pavilions, and a 19-hectare amusement park, in which 56 of the 58 countries of the British Empire participated. Sir Lawrence Weaver, who was director of the UK exhibits at the British Empire Exhibition, so all the commercial and trade exhibits, recorded his experiences and thoughts on his exhibition making in a riveting book called Exhibitions and the Arts of Display, published in 1925, richly illustrated with examples of work from the Wembley panel, a crop of architects cultivated by Weaver, who designed many of the stands and fittings thanks to his patronage. And the primary message of the text is around coordination of design for group advertising. There's a real similarity between our earlier example of the BBC and of the London Underground. And the employment, once again, of these architects show the spectrum of styles of the period. And this was a real novelty in British exhibition design, to use architecture to coordinate different industries. They would normally, otherwise, they would design the infrastructure as Simpson and Ayrton had done, but often it would be specialised stand fitters who would do things like the stands I'm showing you. So what Weaver was doing in employing architects was elevating the arts of display to a standard worthy of the lofty ideals of inter-imperial trade and commerce. And I'll just show you a few more examples of architectural work. These were all done by leading architects like Clough Williams-Ellis, who I mentioned earlier, wrote the book England and the Octopus. And part of the reason I'm trying to show you this is, I suppose, their connection to Metroland. So Wembley was in what had been rural northwest Middlesex, now northwest London, and 20 years before the exhibition, most of it had been largely open countryside with small villages dotted around. But in the 10s and 20s, formerly rural Middlesex was transformed by aggressive development by the Metropolitan Railway Company, hence the name Metro Land, whose train line ran through these areas north into the Chiltern Hills, and they were followed by other private developers. And I just sort of use these images because on the one hand, you were being sold if you moved out to the suburbs, as the advertisers of the Metropolitan Railway Company encourage you to do, by this vision in the central image of sort of bucolic rural life. On the other hand, it was a site of this enormous imperial exhibition, and it was these sorts of houses which were eating up the countryside through unplanned sprawl. And the other thing I just want to mention is that a lot of these stands evoked for people, and we'll see this in a moment, in the way that they were about commerce, trade and industrial design, that architecture could be very useful to advertise products and industry, and fancy factories, as they were called, began to spring up during the 1920s and 1930s. And here's an example. J.B. Priestley, in his English Journey of 1934, wrote that, quote, "The Great West Road looked very odd. Being new, it did not look English. We might have suddenly rolled into California, or for that matter, into one of the main avenues of the old exhibitions, like the Franco-British exhibition of my boyhood," and that was an earlier exhibition held in Shepherd's Bush in the first decade of the 20th century. But it makes this connection, I think, between industry, commerce, architecture, factories and exhibitions. So we'll just run through very quickly things like the Hoover Factory by Wallace Gilbert and Partners, which shows these were called the fancy factories. I mean, I try to use contemporary images, as you will have noticed, which is why a lot of them are black and white. But if you're ever in Perivale, you should see the brilliant colour of the Hoover Factory, of the Firestone Factory on the Great West Road. Indeed, the Great West Road had a golden mile of factories, as it was known, leading west towards Syon Corner, including Henley's Garage, shown there at the top, with a curved concrete canopy and a 130-foot advertising tower in lacquered copper and a neon clock face. Simmons Aero Accessories, also by Wallace Gilbert and Partners, which had a plane-like plan and a sculpted figure of a pilot and an eagle at the top of the enormous tower, and the Springvale Electrical Stand Fitting Company, which resembled a ship's bridge. The Great West Road was a sort of 1930s Las Vegas strip, and indeed many of the factories were illuminated at night to give precisely that impression. The Wallace Gilbert and Partners factories stood out in particular because of their colour and ornamentation. These owed much to a fad for all things Egyptian, precipitated by the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter in 1922. And the Paris exhibition, the exhibition of decorative art, from which the phrase Art Deco, which is normally applied to this period, came, though in the 1960s, had helped to spread this Egyptian language globally. In London, Camden, specifically the Carrera cigarette factory of the mid-1920s, is another brilliant example of factory architecture as advertising. And you can see the Egyptian motifs in commercial architecture again. Adelaide House in commercial architecture, which we're not going into in a great deal of detail, by Burnett and Partners from 1925 on the riverside just by London Bridge, is another example. Just off Regent Street, Ideal House was designed as the headquarters of the National Radiator Company, a European subsidiary of an American company, which resembled a miniature of its New York parent company's skyscraper shown on the right. There was also Dickens and Jones on Regent Street itself, which used Egyptianizing blocky Ionic scrolls on its thin Portland stone facade, shown in detail at the top there. Indeed, the whole of the Regent Street, which was rebuilt between 1906 and 1927 to increase the ground rents for the Crown Estate, used various decorative motifs, both in the block facades and shop fronts, to attract the new breed of consumers, the middle classes travelling in from the new suburbs peripheral to the capital, like Wembley and the other towns of Metroland. The old shops of Regent Street were increasingly competing with larger and larger department stores. So here's an example of the transformation of Regent Street. On the left is the old Liberty and Company, and on the right is East India House, which is the, again, imperial theme, but was the sort of new flagship store of Liberty. And below is Vigo House on the right, it is the newer block, which now, I think, Burberry occupy. And this is the Tudor House, which was the main Liberty headquarters just off Regent Street. You can see it on the top right image there, just peeking down Great Marlborough Street. Another example of this sort of element of fantasy, built with the timbers of the decommissioned HMS Hindustan and the HMS Indomitable by Edwin Thomas and Edwin Stanley Hall, father and son, or Selfridges on Oxford Street, designed by American and British Beaux-Arts leaders, including Daniel Burnham, with giant order, highly ornamental Ionic columns appended to steel stanchions. This theme of fancy and fantasy lent itself also to the realm of film, and the new typology of the picture house, or the cinema, greatly advanced in this country by the passing of the Cinematograph Act in 1927, which imposed a quota of British films on cinema operators, and which led in turn to a rush for cinemas to attract audiences to ensure they received the best films. The Carlton Cinema on the Essex Road in Islington is symptomatic, again, of the Egyptomania I've just been describing, but there could also be Moorish villages in the atmospheric interior of the Astoria in Finsbury, shown here in Finsbury Park, or the Gothic fantasy of the Tooting Granada. So we'll end, or start to end, with the architecture of austerity. Because the interwar years are typically characterized as ones of economic depression and social deprivation, as I've hinted several times already. And so what I want to do is try to present very briefly a slightly more optimistic view of things by looking at aspects of public architecture. The civic centre, a topic on which I could bore you to tears, was the name given in the interwar period to grouped municipal buildings, often around and including a town hall. They would include facilities like a public assembly hall for dances and shows and other entertainments, a council chamber and suite of committee rooms, a rates hall where people could pay their local taxes, and municipal offices where the business of administration would get done, and then perhaps sundry other facilities like courtrooms and police accommodation, fire stations, central public libraries, and sometimes sports and other recreational facilities. Just sort of think of that as a vision of your local authority, because we don't have so many of them anymore. The idea of the civic centre had come from America, from progressivist political circles around some of the major metropolises of New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Denver, and Cleveland, and it entered architectural and planning discourse in this country via C.H. Riley and Lord Lever at the Department of Civic Design in the School of Architecture in Liverpool. And it was propagated by the department's journal, the Town Planning Review. By the late 1920s, the idea had really taken hold, with new civic centre projects, sometimes called by other names, planned for municipalities like Southampton, which we saw earlier, which claims to be the first interconnecting civic centre in Britain, in Swansea by Percy Thomas and Partners, another majorly influential civic centre of the period, and Norwich, often considered to be one of the great public buildings of the interwar years by Stephen Rowland Pearce and Charles Holloway James, who were tutors at the Architectural Association in the 30s. Other older Victorian municipalities, which had built grand and patrician town halls in the 19th century, like Bolton, like Leeds, and like Manchester, shown here, aggrandised their existing buildings with extensions or additional buildings. So I'm showing you Alfred Waterhouse's Manchester Town Hall at the top, and then the aerial view. So there's the old town hall of the Manchester Town Hall extension and Central Reference Library, shown more clearly here by Emmanuel Vincent Harris. Civic centre, in other words, became a byword for modern urban governance, for a way of the municipality demonstrating all the civic services it offered to the townspeople. The idea of the civic centre was one which endured until the 1970s. It was flexible enough to accommodate different conceptions of local government as the infrastructure of the post-war welfare state started to be built up in the 1930s. But the diminution of local government under Thatcher meant that the idea no longer held so much sway as an index of civic pride and municipal rivalry. But as I say, I introduce it here to encourage you to reflect on this as we enter a new age of devolution deals with new metropolitan mayors and, albeit waning, plans for a northern powerhouse. How could architecture once again reimagine the idea of the civic, perhaps through the civic centre? This whole question of the centre in civic centre is an interesting one, We take it for granted that we have different sorts of centres, particularly in urban life. Civic centres, social centres, cultural centres, leisure centres, health centres. But the centre, which is again a peculiarly 20th century and especially interwar word, seems to be a particularly Americanizing conception of the organising of services. And it's one, I think, that has an analogy with the public and commercial corporation of collective advertising about which I've been speaking. And this is a theme throughout this introduction to interwar architecture, of things coming together and of architecture helping to do that, helping to define new spaces and new possibilities of connection. Especially in the health centre, another new phrase of the 1910s, which had important socially progressive manifestations in the interwar years. This is the Pioneer Health Centre, which housed the Peckham experiment from 1926, given new architectural expression in the mid-1930s by the engineer Owen Williams, who I mentioned as a consultant for the Wembley Empire exhibition. This centre provided birth control advice to local working class communities. Okay, this is massively emancipating for people in poorer areas of the country at this time, and created a social club that made it distinct from contemporary medical practice. This is partly why it closed down after the nationalisation of the health service in 1949. The Finsbury Health Centre is perhaps the more famous example, built on Pine Street in Clerkenwell in the late 1930s. In Finsbury, a borough with severe public health and housing issues in this period, there had been attempts to consolidate health services through a child welfare and maternity centre, a small vernacular neo-Georgian hut designed by Edwin Stanley Hall, who we encountered earlier as the architect of Liberties. But after the Labour sweep across the London councils in 1934, Finsbury Council developed a new and comprehensive Finsbury Plan, and a new public health department was established in 1936. Chuni Lal Ketal, chairman of this new body and later mayor of Finsbury from 1938, the first South Asian mayor in the country, approached Bertold Lebetkin's nascent practice Tecton, formed with 6 promising grad students from the Architectural Association, to take on this new and challenging brief. And together Finsbury and Tecton landed their public health spaceship in autumn 1938. Built on an H plan and divided into 2 wings, fixed functions on one side and more fluid spaces like clinics and treatment rooms where it was felt spatial and material needs would change over time, were placed either side of a central entrance space. As Elizabeth Darling has described it, the sheer magnitude of the health problem in Finsbury goes some way to explaining the overwhelmingly didactic, if not dictatorial, character of the design. But its origins lie also in the model of healthcare which the centre embodied. Centralised, bureaucratised, there is space for offices and archives here, designed by architectural experts and run by health experts, Finsbury leaves the sense of a building created as a production line for health with little room for personal sentiment or self-responsibility. And I think you can argue that to an extent. I said earlier, and we'll start to wrap up now, that I wanted to show you what doing architecture, or doing design, to put it more capaciously, looked like in the interwar years. And so I want to end very quickly by looking at one of the most representative projects of the period, the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, that you should all hopefully know, to start thinking about what being an architect meant too. Because I think that if you, as the professionals of the future, have some understanding of that, you'll be better placed to think critically about the present of architectural practice and how to find ideas to change what's bad and save what's good. But more fundamentally, and we don't have time to talk about this now, to understand that all the conventions of what you do and what you think you're doing and how you're being educated, as Patrick will tell you in greater detail than I can, are contingent and have a history of which it is essentially your professional responsibility to understand and reflect on critically. So we'll end by talking about the RIBA headquarters and think through some of these issues, in particular about the unification of the profession and statutory registration of architects, which happened in 1931. But to make it less boring, we'll think about a building. Before acquiring and developing the Portland Place site, the RIBA had for some years been established at 9 Conduit Street in an 18th century townhouse. Though significantly expanded and altered to accommodate the RIBA's growing membership and organisation, by the late 20s it was decided that not only did the Institute need new premises, it also needed a larger footprint than the Conduit Street site would allow. And so they acquired a lease on Portland Place, and by late 1930 had pulled together a programme for a new building led by an eminent jury of assessors, including people that we've met today: Charles Gilbert Scott, Charles Holden, also Robert Atkinson, who assessed the competition for Norwich City Hall and for Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, and H.B. Lanchester, who had been involved in a replanning of New Delhi. This was a real sort of bringing together of some of the big swingers in architecture of the period. An open, empire-wide competition was arranged in 1931 and concluded in May the following year, partly according to RIBA's own rhetoric to help stimulate the sector after the crash. And it attracted 284 entries and was won by Gray Wernham, shown here lighting his cigarette on the left, known primarily as a housing architect. And though his design was not universally praised, he was considered the right man to be appointed. As Atkinson reflected, for the competitors, a most unusual building was demanded of them. There were, he said, really 5 buildings in one: a meeting room with access and cloakrooms, exhibition galleries and a banqueting hall, a library with stat rooms, council rooms, committee rooms and offices for the business of the society, and offices for letting. Though the need for financial stringency meant that additional office accommodation was removed and the overall provision of space, the footprint of the building, was reduced. A new design was settled by late 1933, and the building was constructed with a steel frame and faced with Portland stone, opened in December 1934 by King George and Queen Mary. But what I want to do is reframe the building, the briefing and the design of 66, in the context of the RIBA's abiding concern in the first decades of the 20th century, which is professionalisation. These two projects are rarely linked, but I think that 66 in fact provides a useful prism through which to understand the battle for the Architects' Registration Act of 1931, which effectively closed the profession and gave statutory recognition initially to registered architects and later just architects after an amending act in 1938. And this has additional value, though we can't talk about it now, of looking closely at the debates and impact of unification and registration from the view of professional practice, rather than just through what it does to architectural education. 66 was a monument first to the so-called unification of the profession, which had been divided since the memorialist debates of the 1890s and before, the architecture or profession debate I alluded to earlier, and secondly and consequentially to the Architects' Registration Act, which came into force in the same year that the Institute drew up its brief for the new premises. So it's obvious that this was on the RIBA's mind. Such a monument, I contend, was conceived because the RIBA's authority was highly contested, which is a fact we now often forget. And I think this ran much deeper than the Institute's triumphalist literature would lead us to believe, and is why the Architects' Registration Council, which is now what we call the ARB, was set up as an independent body. The Society of Architects, a splinter group set up to lobby for registration in the 1880s, had remained its biggest rival until the two bodies amalgamated, not, as others had hoped, federalised in the early 1920s. And even then, there was a significant proportion of the architectural population who were not members of the Institute during this period. In 1921, the year the Society of Architects and the RIBA joined together, this was about 48%. And though by 1931 that figure had leapt to 71% of the profession as members of RIBA, that leaves 29% not members of the RIBA, and indeed within the 71% of members, there was often dissent and debate about what exactly the role and remit of RIBA was. The new premises were important to the RIBA because they stamped authority. They claimed for the RIBA status as the body of architects and the architectural profession, but also for the wider world of the building industry and the wider public. It projected a body, after all, and by major concession, a body without statutory authority for practitioners, of command and influence at a time, I would argue, as I've said, of anxiety and even vulnerability. All of this may seem rather remote from the building, but I think thinking in this way explains how and why in parallel the profession went through what I call a refashioning, an assertion of control and authority to reach architects and their growing public. And I think that's something that you, as aspiring professionals, ought to know about. What we must also keep firmly in mind is what sort of profession was being closed through the Registration Act. This was still very much the brass plate practice of the gentleman architect, and not the salaried local authority architect, which came to predominate after the war. And I think it's easy to make unfavourable comparisons between private practice and the sort of halcyon days of the post-war welfare state. But I think, actually, in a way, that sort of brass plate private practice, for better or for worse, resembles the sort of practices that you may well find yourself in your working lives. And anyway, the Registration Act, I think, was driven by a particular conception of architectural public service as much as it was by profit. 66 has often been likened to a gentleman's club with an air of exclusivity and impenetrability, a space for architects to discuss and officiate over the profession. Typologically, indeed, it does fulfill some criteria for this. The austere, box-like exterior with a strict classical gravity contains an interior with a grand central staircase, members' rooms and banqueting facilities, and private spaces for the conducting of institute work, like the council chamber and 2 large meeting halls. There's the Henry Florence Hall on the left, and fine materials furnish grand rooms arranged around a central axis. What I'm arguing here is that this is counteracted by the programmatic aspiration more of a town hall. There were spaces for public assembly. The multi-purpose Florence Hall had a sprung floor for dancing, but was also intended to host examinations and exhibitions. Indeed, exhibitions were a key part of RIBA policy for public education, an area which grew in importance as the Institute woke up to the need for publicity or public relations. The building's inaugural exhibition of international architecture, 1924 to 1934, I'm showing you the plan of it here, included sections on planning the dwelling, planning for health, the architecture of transport, and the architecture of pleasure. Okay, the sorts of building typologies and debates I've been highlighting to you here, situating British architecture in the context of common ideals of the international profession, and demonstrating new typologies and innovations in design and practice for wider society. 66 also had facilities for typically municipal functions, like the council chamber, like a library, and spaces for administration. So its intentions were civic. One of the frequently commented on aspects of the building in the 30s was the freedom of circulation, the transparency of design, and the lack of corridors. These were key to the modernity of the plan and key features of what was called by several newspapers, believe it or not, the perfect building. The interwar period saw the architectural profession recast discourse and practice in increasingly complex ways in terms of the public, whose size and strength had been bolstered by the expansion of the franchise. This professional refashioning was not prompted nor conceived exclusively by self-identifying modernists, but also and anxiously by the prevailing architectural establishment. This was a common concern and a common endeavour by all of the architects that we've been looking at today. This was because architects had to compromise, as architects now, with interests stronger than their own, unlike the strong public officials, say, of the post-war years. Various constructs of the public, the consuming public, the shopping public, the ratepayer, the citizen, the sorts of publics for whom buildings that we've seen were designed, commanded perhaps a sort of ethical check at times to the ever stronger commercial development forces of the prevailing planning regime. Architects spoke this language, I think, not just to recommend themselves to a growing democratic constituency, but also to influence and reflect the priorities of their new clients. 66 Portland Place was the profession's symbol, yes, but also its vehicle. And I think that's probably a good place to stop.